Good morning, it's Miss Lopresti, everyone's favorite teacher, and today you are going to listen to a presentation. It's more like a prezi about our next unit of study. So during this presentation, I'm going to ask you some questions. You're going to have some questions that are embedded into the prezi, and you will have to answer these questions. The program will not allow you to go ahead and skip through the presentation, so unfortunately you have to listen to the whole thing, but the presentation will provide you with, I believe, the necessary background information for you to understand what we're reading in the textbook. So take a look at the title, and what do you know about reason? What does reason mean to you? Did you ever hear of the age of reason? How about the Enlightenment? Have you heard of the Enlightenment? Look at those base words that we talked about. We have enlightened. You know, what does it mean to be enlightened? What we're going to see is that we see a challenging now of existing tradition. You know, we looked at the Puritans as a unit of study. We saw how there was an emphasis in religious doctrine, but we're going to see that there's going to be more of a questioning now during the Enlightenment of those practices, more of an emphasis on reason, on the mind, an emphasis on man rather than God. So we're going to take a look at the first slide. And let's see. And we have characteristics of the Enlightenment. If you could just read through that first slide, the period between 1714 and 1818. And you can see that, you know, this period was characterized by a rebirth. We had an outgrowth of literature, music, the arts. There was more of a tolerance for religious differences, and then there was that skepticism that we talked about and that questioning of religious doctrine. We saw that this questioning, not only did it lead to some radical changes in religious thought, but it also resulted in some radical changes to writing. Writing became a weapon for change. And we're going to take a look at how literature was also influenced by this time period. So moving on to the next slide, education. You know, one way of learning a new unit of study is to kind of look back at the previous ones. We learned that education to the Puritans was a means to learning the Bible, to learning their religion, being able to interpret God's signs. And here, if you take a look at this slide, and try to move into it a little closer. You know, we see for that first bullet that there are periods of religious revivals now. We read Jonathan Edwards and his Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God. So think back at how that was different than what we learned about the Puritans, their belief in salvation, those Calvinistic ideas, the tulip, T-U-L-I-P. How was that idea challenged by Jonathan Edwards and his idea of being reborn? We have Puritan colleges that were founded. We talked about Harvard College being founded in 1636. We're seeing that curriculum is now changing, and it is there's more of an emphasis on science. You know, natural philosophy is what it was called back then, astronomy and math. You know, and these were not subjects that were available previously. Okay, moving on to the next slide, we see that there is a new learning now. It's different, you know, it was reflected in the university learning, and we see the new learning with some of the enlightened thinkers, such as John Locke, who was influential in this period. John Locke had a profound influence on political philosophy. You know, he stressed religious tolerance. He also stressed the complete separation of church and state. We saw some ideas of Isaac Newton. You know, some of us think of Isaac Newton with the apple, right? He was a key figure in this scientific revolution. He had new laws of motion and gravity. Francis Bacon, with his scientific method and understanding that there is a procedure that can be followed use your reason to make sense out of your surroundings. And Rene Descartes, I don't believe he's on the slide, but he was somebody that influenced that whole idea of scientific thinking. You know, Rene Descartes was the person who said, "I think, therefore I am." And he's often regarded as the first enlightened thinker to use reason to develop the natural sciences. So now take a minute and think about these people and what they did and how they could possibly, how their ideas possibly changed the world and how thinking was at that time. I'm going to pause just for a minute and let you think about that and process that and how they could have influenced the world with those ideas. So now, what were some of the political and theological ideas at the time? Move into the next slide. I'm not sure if you've ever heard the word deism, but take a minute to read the definition of deism on that slide. How is that different than that idea of predestination? You read it again, look for keywords. We have the belief that a creator made the universe, but does not control any part of life and does not influence anything in nature. Okay, another keyword, rejected supernatural explanations. You know, think of the crucible, think of the witch trials. Now, what were some of the other ideas? We saw liberalism, republicanism. These were two ideas that are really prevalent in the Declaration of Independence. The idea that, looking at that first bullet, all men are by nature equally free and independent. We have certain inheritable rights. We have the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, property. And it was John Locke that said no one ought to harm another in his life, health, liberty, or possessions. So this is a radical change that rejected monarchism, it rejected the monarchy, it rejected tyrants, and believed that nobody has the right to violate your human rights. And this is an idea that stays with us even today. How do we see those rights? How do people today make sure that those rights are being valued, that they're not being abused? And what is republicanism? You know, reading the slide, you know, is it different than liberalism? Do you see any similarities, any contrasts? Take a minute to read that. So moving in, we have a quote from Thomas Paine. The duty of a patriot is to protect his country from its government. So before standing up against the king, that could result in treason and your death. You know, that's a scary thing to be accused of treason. And here we have, you know, enlightened thinkers that are saying that we should have a government ruled by the people. You know, and this was a very volatile time in history. You know, Thomas Paine was a wanted man. He was wanted for treason in England. He was known to, what's the word I'm looking for? You know, he was well known in France because he also believed in the independence of the French people, and he believed in overthrowing their monarchy. So he was a key player in the French Revolution as well. So the idea of republicanism, the idea of government by the people, the consent of the government by the people. And these are ideas that we're going to see reflected in the writings. Explorations in science and nature. We're going to see a movement from divine law. Divine law being the law, the word of God, what's in the scripture, you know, towards natural laws and the rights of men. We see things being challenged. You know, the Bible was challenged. Before, you could be arrested for heresy, and we saw that with the Crucible and in some of the other works. But in this case, you know, there wasn't this disbelief in God, there was a belief in God. It was a belief in God as a clockmaker. And I like to use the analogy of God being in the back seat. You know, the Puritans believed God was in the front seat and he controlled every aspect of your life. Well, the enlightened thinkers, the rationalists, I could call them, they believed that, you know, the earth is like a clock. You know, you think of your watch. Somebody makes it, but it just keeps on ticking and it runs itself. So man was really at the center of the universe with these ideas of the enlightened thinkers. And you can see that with, let me just go back, you can see that with this picture of Benjamin Franklin. You know, you see the angels behind him and you see them tinkering with experiments. You know, God gave us reason. He gave us a reason so that we can use it, so we can improve the world for the greater good. Okay, so we're going to stop for a minute. And I want you to think about how, what the Enlightenment, what legacy could the Enlightenment have left us now that we talked about some of these people. You know, there are some key terms that I use: the greater good, social justice. You know, what is it that we see today that was started during this period in history? And do we today question authority at times? You know, when do we realize that something is unjust or unfair, and when is it warranted to challenge that way of thinking? Okay, writers of the Revolution. Start out with a picture of Poor Richard's Almanac, written by Benjamin Franklin, signed under the pen name Poor Richard. People loved reading almanacs at this time. They loved to read about the weather predictions, astronomy, horoscopes, what was going on politically. You know, writing now was informative. Writing wasn't there to stress anybody's religious beliefs. You know, on Plymouth Plantation, we saw William Bradford portraying the Puritans as being chosen, the chosen people. Here, we have more of a discussion of the times and that challenging of thought that we see over and over again. Satire was used to challenge thought. Hyperboles, parodies, you know, exposing flaws and criticizing society. Poor Richard was full of anecdotes about life, aphorisms, short, clever statements about things. And people believed that Poor Richard was an actual person when, in fact, it was Benjamin Franklin behind the pen. On this other slide, we see writing. Instead of those religious writings, we see it reflecting the changing world. We see new genres emerging: biographies, diaries, almanacs. So we talked about the rights of men, and we talked about all men being created equal, all men having the right to life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. And we have an institution of slavery that is in existence in society during the 1700s. So if you take a look at this slide, you know, colonialism and slavery, you know, slavery and the slave trade was in effect, and it was stated that it was, I have here for the second bullet, the guise of civilizing in the name of reason. So, you know, hiding behind that idea that man has the right to civilize other areas of the world, you know, I guess justified the actions of the slave trade. And there's going to be more on this in slides to follow. Okay, let's see here. I think, okay, there's a poem by Phyllis Wheatley on being brought from Africa. I want you to take a minute and read that poem. And then I want you to ask yourself, how does Phyllis Wheatley address the issue of slavery in this poem? Be careful, because you have to read between the lines. Phyllis Wheatley was a slave that was brought from Africa, and she was educated by the Wheatley family. And she was probably one of the first anti-slavery writings that we saw in America. So read that poem and think of how possibly irony could be used to express her opinion about that issue. I have some more slides. Slaves came from different backgrounds, different regions, different languages. Slaves were only identifiable by the color of their skin. They were denied an education. This was a convenient way for slave owners to view them as subhuman and to deny them any kind of natural rights. And we have somebody like Frederick Douglass, who was a slave, and we're going to read his slave narrative later in the school year. Frederick Douglass said, "You have seen how a man was made a slave. You shall see how a slave was made a man." And what's interesting is there's not a lot of writings from firsthand experiences, autobiographies from slaves, since slaves were denied an education. Frederick Douglass tells his story of how he was able to educate himself. And he believed in a self-made man and wrote a lecture in 1895 about that. Benjamin Franklin, he wrote about moral perfection in his autobiography. So now there's this idea in perfection that we didn't see before. Nobody could be godlike, and God ruled every aspect of your life. And now we have people that are godlike, that are perfectible with hard work and perseverance. And that's a theme that we're going to see in writing. So all of these radical changes led to our American ideals in the beliefs that we have today. Think of how those ideas carried through. In our next unit of study, we're going to see that idea of civilizing other people, of moving and expanding when we get into Manifest Destiny and some of the literature in the 1800s. So thanks for listening, and I hope that this was informative so that now when we spend some time in class, you'll be able to read on your own and hopefully have some of that background information that you'll need so that it all makes sense. So good luck, and I'll see you in class.